What's up, tacos? It's Lord's time, and we're here. My name is Pat Weston, and I am joined, as always, with Atlas tonight.
That's me, Atlas,
That's
tonight.
And it's time for another episode of Lords, episode 28.
Episode 28. Can you believe it?
I can. I feel like you and I are very dedicated, hardworking people, and we feel passionate about talking about random ass shit once a
Wow.
week.
I really respect that you think that about me. Also, I think that about you. So I guess it makes sense. We're here at 28.
Yeah. Hell yeah. And I
Because-
think episode 10 just got uploaded to YouTube.
Yeah.
Which is actually the first World War I episode that we did
Yes.
about the Battle of Verdun. So that
Believe it or
is now
not.
fresh on YouTube.
Believe it or not, it's planned by me. For the first episode that we did, which was episode 10, about, I think it was the first episode we did about like a real life, like deep history kind of thing. At least war history. I mean, like something, because it's before the World War II one, right? So
Yeah, World War II was next because that was the World War II speed run.
Yeah.
Well, we did the one before that. Any of the real life quote unquote ones before that were the history of Square Enix. Then
Right.
there's the Omseti, and then there's the John Mayer episode.
Right.
And national parks, but that could be a little
right, yeah, a little bit of both.
tricky.
Yeah.
A little bit of both. Yeah.
So we did the Verdun episode, and in the Verdun episode, I brought up another battle multiple times, which was the Battle of the Somme. And in that episode, I said, we'll definitely talk about that on stream. We'll definitely have an
Right,
episode
yeah.
about the Somme.
Yeah,
And when I saw Verdun was coming up in the list of episodes we posted, I thought, well, perfect, here's the time. It's basically the sequel. And, you know, what they say about sequels, they're usually worse than the first. And that is exactly the case with the Somme.
Great.
So, the Somme, do you know what it is at all? Do you know what the Battle of the Somme was?
No, I don't.
So it's one of the most like major battles of the First World War. It's in English history, famously like, remember the Somme is a saying in England.
I do know that. Yes.
And it's a battle that it's real bad. A lot of bad things going on. And it's just another example of bad leadership and throwing thousands of men to their deaths for no reason. But it's not as, I will say, like, we talked about the First World War before and how, like, gruesome and terrible it was. Like, we talked about trench warfare and, like, how living in a trench was like. We talked about how it's possibly the worst war to, like, ever happen in the terms of, like, actual combat, you know?
Sure.
In the Verdun episode, we talked about the whole Battle of Verdun. France fought Germany. There was extremely high casualties on both sides.
Yep, because it was basically a battle for ego.
Yeah, there was
So-
that. That's what I was just about to like bring up. Is that battle had no purpose? Like it was
Right.
completely like just done. Like it was just like, oh, we can win. No, we can win. We're gonna win. Like it was pride. Pride kept that
Right.
battle and cost hundreds of thousands of lives.
Very sad.
Yeah. And in an episode, like I said, I mentioned the Somme. And today's episode is going to be just about that battle, which, believe it or not, would have even more casualties than Verdun.
Hey, congratulations to this battle. You took the top spot. Well, at least for now.
Yeah. So and just for the show, to give a good, before we even get into it, like an idea of this battle, Verdun had like, I think the French had like 364,000 casualties. And it took 300 days. The Somme took 141 days.
How did Europe repopulate? I mean,
Yeah.
what?
We'll touch on it at the end of today's episode, actually, because Somme had a very big effect on some things. And yeah, so in half the time for less than half the time of the Battle of Verdun, there was a lot more deaths. So it was real bad.
There's no one to bang. There's no one to bang. Everyone's dead.
So for one single battle, the Somme had more deaths than any other battle in the First World War, and I think it's second in history still, next to Stalingrad, which is number one.
Oof.
So, yeah, the Somme is pretty bad, and let's just get right into my thing. That was all just off the top of my head. So let's just go into my script I have here. I got pictures prepared too on stream. So if you're watching on the stream, you can see some pictures show up. We'll be following along some portraits, some maps, cool stuff like that. It's just one map. But anyway, before we even go in the battle itself, we have to talk about leading up to the battle and what's going on, because it's a major part of everything. And so I have part one, which is just a prelude to the war, and I'll start off by just bringing up a map of Europe. This is a World War I map of December 1916, showing what everything was like at the time. So there was the Triple Entente, which is the force. This is known as the Allies. They'll become known as the Allies during basically the Somme. They changed their name. And then the Central Powers, which are the German powers. So as you can see in the map, Germany, and if you're listening, Germany has the entire middle of Europe, and it's surrounded on both sides by the Allies with Russia and France. At this time, if we're starting back in 1915, the war had not been going very well for the Allies. The Central Powers were in fact winning at that time.
Yeah.
They had just lost Belgium and parts of northern France to German advances, which if you look at the map and you want to Google search a map or something, you can see the top of France and Belgium are completely taken by the Central Powers.
Right. So is this post or pre-Verdun?
This is the same time.
Oh, okay. So this is literally what's going on.
Yeah. So in 1915, where we're starting right now, neither has happened yet, and we will talk about the start of Verdun during this. Sure. They are very related to each other.
Gotcha.
So having just lost parts of Belgium to German advances, and the German Empire at this time had a better armed, trained, and more fierce fighting force than the Allied powers, little did they know that already in 1916, 1915, the German army was beginning to wear thin. They were using more weapons than they could produce, and they were having to conscript young soldiers to their lines. So these feared veteran trained elites were now being supplemented with young 18-year-old kids.
That's green. That's what we call green troops.
And the Austro-Hungarian forces were perhaps the worst off of any nation in the entire war. They're all inexperienced. They used weapons from the previous century. And at the beginning of the war, they didn't even know what grenades were until the Serbians they were fighting threw them at them.
Oh,
so their troops literally didn't know what grenades were. And to keep that in mind, in like 1914, when this was going down, people like United Kingdom, for example, had been fighting in Africa using grenades. So they weren't like a new thing. Like they've been around, but they literally didn't know what they were.
So they landed in their trenches and were just kind of like, "Oh, are they giving us water?" Or something?
Yeah, well, this is before trench warfare, but Serbia is a very mounted area, and they would throw grenades over hills, and they would just land and be like, "What's that?" Boom, like that. Yeah. The Austro-Hungarian army really sucked ass like this, and it never got better the whole war. They were just terrible.
Oh God!
Despite this, how bad they were, the Russian Empire's massive army was still struggling to make an easy war against them, due to the German support on their lines. Germany was coming and basically backing up all of the Austrian lines because Germany shares a border with Russia, and they couldn't let Russia, just come into Germany. So they had to go help the Austro-Hungarians in their fights. So at this time in 1915, all fronts had gone to a halt. The Western Front was being valiantly held by the French forces, but struggling against recent German advancements in Belgium that we talked about earlier. The elite fighting force that was the British were almost entirely gone, either dead or unable to fight.
Woof.
So Britain joined the war in 1914, and at this time, besides Germany, Britain was the only elite army in the world. They had a standing, trained veteran army from fighting in Africa. So their people knew how to fight. They knew how to use their weapons, and they had experience, which is huge. So,
big time.
That was a big bonus for the Allies to have these English soldiers, and then their army wasn't very big, and the British role in the war up to this point was basically supporting the French. So they would throw divisions with French divisions, and at this point in the war, they had been mostly lost just because they were at a standstill and getting shot by Germans.
Yeah. Sure.
So during this standstill, on December 6th to the 8th of 1915, the Allied leaders decided to meet and discuss their war plans. And they would do so in Chantilly, France, and this would be known as the Second Chantilly Conference because they had done it before, to discuss the war effort between the leaders of the Allied powers. And this would be where the plan was decided. And they would have simultaneous offenses on the Eastern Front from the Russian army, the Italian Front from the Italian army, and on the Western Front from a joint effort of the Franco-British armies. This would be done all at once for one reason: to deny the Central Powers time to move troops between fronts, and force them to send elite German troops from the Eastern Front away to the Western Front, giving the Russians only the Austro-Hungarian forces to deal with, which, as we brought up, were vastly inferior.
Right. That's some grade A tactics right there, folks.
So they thought we're gonna slam onto Germany. Russia will get a huge slack because all the elite stormtroopers are gonna have to now go over to the other side to deal with the more immediate threat to their homeland, basically.
Yeah.
And in this same month, we'll bring his picture up right now. One General Sir Douglas Haig would replace the previous field marshal, named Sir John French, as Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, or the BEF. So just to be clear, the leader of the British Army's last name was French, but he was not French, he was British. His name was just French.
They're all allies, right? You know?
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying, like, it is a little confusing, because it did to me when I was reading it, like, wait, they're not saying the French. They're saying this guy's name. Oh, I got it. There's a Sir John French, who's a man. And he got replaced as Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force by Douglas Haig, which is a name we'll be bringing up.
His ancestors were French, you know? Maybe his great-grandfather was French.
Oh, I'm sure there's some reason, but it's just, like, in the sake of talking about French and British, like, cohabitation in the military, having a British leader named French doesn't help anything.
No, you're right.
That's not why he lost his job. I don't know why he lost his job, but he did get replaced. Sir Douglas Haig was a new face. He was a new
name.
Was that?
I said, it's probably because of the name.
It's the name, yeah. They didn't like it. As you can see by his picture, he's got lots of medals. He's very fancy. He's got Sir in his name. He, big leader. He'd be a new face in charge of a new generation of British soldiers because, as I mentioned before, they're mostly all exhausted with their trained veteran troops from the start of the war. The British were known as the elites at the time, like I mentioned before, and even more so than the Germans. So the British were kind of like the feared force because they had been kind of winning in Africa against tribes that had been beat, like for example, the Zulus, which, that wasn't an easy war. It was really, they lost a lot of men. So back then, propaganda made it seem like it was, but it wasn't. So the British elite troops were responsible for a lot of early Allied victories in the Western Front because the French troops were completely untrained. But now the tables have kind of turned because they've lost almost all their veterans, and now almost the entire French army is a veteran force because they've been fighting the whole time. And Haig wanted to lead a British offensive in Flanders, which is in Belgian, kind of border between Belgium and France, close to the British supply routes. But the reason he wanted to do that is because this brand new thing was threatening a lot of the supply routes in the ocean, which was German U-boats. World War I submarines did exist. Right. They were death traps.
Yeah.
But they were out there. Not a lot of people survived who were U-boat crewmen, but they were there, and it was causing a huge problem because sonar didn't exist. Depth charges didn't exist yet. So this was a new thing. Submarines were kind of dominating the waters. Britain said we need to cut off their ports and their supplies to that as best we can. So they tried. That was his plan. However, due to the British playing a lesser role in the force in the Western Front, he was assigned under the authority of the French commander, which would be Joseph Joffre, who he was kind of the leader of the Allied forces in the First World War overall. We talked about him a little bit in the Verdun episode. But he basically had complete control over the British Army. What he said went. However, in January 1916, he did agree with the British, and Haig got the rights to use the BEF to launch an assault in Flanders, focusing the majority of the British forces there. Rather quickly, though, in only February, this plan would change. The plan was to now have a joint offensive with British and French forces at the point where their lines met, which was astride the Somme River in Picardy, France.
Oh,
And
here we go.
the plan for this assault was to force German forces there, force German forces to gather there, so that the offense at Flanders that they would do after this, that Haig wanted, would be a lot easier to be done with little to no resistance. However, 1 week after this plan was decided upon, the German assaulted the French, trying to get the city of Verdun.
Okay. Well, go back and watch that episode.
Yeah, go back and watch that episode. Everything just changed drastically in their war plans. Verdun got slammed by the Germans out of nowhere. They were not expecting an assault on Verdun, but they needed to hold Verdun. And this forced the French army to divert their divisions at the Somme, eventually reducing the contribution of the French at the Somme to 13 divisions instead of 20 that it was supposed to have. Leaving the British forces with 13 French divisions and 20 British divisions instead of 20. So they lost a lot of men for their Somme attack, which was still planned. But they lost a ton of men who were now sent to Verdun to fight that battle.
I can already imagine that's going to cause a lot of problems.
Yes. By the 31st, and this is the beginning of things getting already bad before it even starts. By the 31st of May, the plan drastically changed. What was meant to be a joint attack to weaken the German strength on other fronts and to allow British easy access to Flanders had now changed to a reduced British-led offensive with the goal of lessening German pressure on Verdun. So now their responsibility was to reduce Verdun's German force.
Jesus.
When their whole point originally was to reduce the force where attack hadn't even happened yet. So things had already been flipped entirely for their plans.
Right. Oh my god.
And on the German side of things, we have our third character, their leader at the time, Erich von Falkenhayn, who we talked about a lot in the Verdun episode. We won't talk about as much of him in this episode because we kind of covered his life and what ended up happening to him. But he intended to end the war by splitting the Anglo-French Entente in 1916 before the material superiority of the Allies to the Central Powers became unbeatable. Falkenhayn planned to cause serious damage to Allied reserves via the attack of a sensitive point, Verdun, forcing the French to counterattack while they weren't ready for it. Like we said before, if you want to know more about Verdun, you can listen to that older episode, which is now up on our YouTube channel, Anime Water, where we went deep into the timeline and even talked about World War I trench conditions and a lot of other World War I information. So we're not going to cover Verdun here. That's been covered.
Man, they got bombed there, though, quite a bit.
Yes.
About big booms.
Yes, big booms happened there.
Big booms.
And yeah, we talked about the Falkenhayn in that episode, as long as the German royalty at the time, with the prince and the Kaiser and all that stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
But what Falkenhayn said about attacking the French while they could showed that at this time, German high command knew that their war was lost. As early as 1916. Because they knew they had no way to match the material supply of the Allies. They were pretty much boxed in. America could send them weapons. Other countries, like other powers like Morocco, could send them weapons. Stuff like that. Like they had access, and the Germans knew we have to attack now before we don't have enough material to attack again. That was what Falkenhayn thought this, at least. He knew what was going on. He knew they didn't have a thing, which falls into World War II, a common German problem, which is overestimating and not realizing you're out of gas. And losing the war because of it. Germany isn't self-sufficient enough to run a world-conquering war, basically, is the bottom line.
Right. Also their location is kind of like already a shitty location because they're in the middle of fucking everybody.
They're literally in the middle.
Literally smack dab in the middle of the continent. So it's just like, what are you going to do? Which direction are you going to go? Pick one, but you're going to get boned from behind from the other one.
And they always pick all the directions. Granted, in World War I, it wasn't. They were fighting a defensive war.
That's true. Yep, I remember we covered that quite a bit. And then they became all about their ego. And then
So it started off as a defensive war. They didn't choose to be attacked at all sides; it just happened. So as Verdun would go on, even more French troops would be diverted from the Somme, which we did talk about in the the Verdun episode, how they got troops from the Somme to help out. Great for Verdun, bad for the Somme. By May, Joffre and Haig had completely changed their expectations of the Somme. Verdun was holding, but it was extremely costly and requiring almost all the French forces.
Yeah.
And the Somme went from being a decisive victory idea to a battle with the only objective being to relieve Verdun and keep Germans in France, and to help the Russians at the Brusilov offensive. Germany would suspend their offense at Verdun in July and would send troops, guns, and ammunition to Picardy at the Somme, which would lead to a similar transfer being done by the French 10th Army to the Somme. So they got some troops back because the Germans started having ideas of what was going on with these French up there, and why weren't they at Verdun. That, you know, they figured out what was going on. Right. And the French would recover a lot of lost ground at Verdun at that battle. Subsequently, when the Germans sent a lot of troops out, that was the first big French victory at Verdun. The Battle of the Somme hadn't even started yet, and already its effects of splitting the Germans was working. On the Eastern Front, on the 4th of June to the 20th, we saw the Brusilov offensive. This could be, it probably will be at one point in its own episode, but I'm going to go over a little bit. This was the Russian attack that would be a 200-mile wide front that would go from the Romanian frontier of Pinsk and eventually would reach the Romanian frontier to Pinsk, and would eventually advance 93 miles and reach the foothills of the Carpathian mountain range. And
that's fucking crazy.
Yeah, massive front. And they would engage in battle against German and Austro-Hungarian troops. During this offensive, and overall, just to throw this number out there, which we'll go over again, this is a lot of battles combined. The Brusilov offensive is like 3 major battles.
Jesus Christ.
The Russians would inflict upon the Central Powers 407,000 prisoners caught and 1,500,000 deaths.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh, World War I is wild.
Yes. The Russians were literally slay queen slay against the Germans and the Austrians. Mostly Austrians. The Austrians just fucking fell over like paper. 3 divisions were ordered from France to the Eastern Front on the 9th of June. So 3 divisions were now just sent from the Somme to help the Russians. So the Somme lost even more men. This puts the original plan of 2020 to 20 British and 10.5 French divisions.
I was gonna say this is one of those classic cases of you can make a plan, it can seem really great, but it's not gonna happen.
You can't foresee everything, and when things can go wrong, they often do go wrong. So this was a very big lesson of that.
Yeah, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, so already the battle hasn't started yet. Again, the offensive at Somme was seen to be necessary to ease the pressure of the other fronts, but the Allies knew full well they were outnumbered. So on the German side of things, their leaders, Falkenhayn, Hindenburg, Ludendorff, which were all German high command,
right,
were forced to send divisions to Russia throughout the summer to prevent a collapse of the Austro-Hungarian army, because they were about to fully break. And then to start a counteroffensive against Romania, because they just decided to declare war on Central Powers in the 27th of August. So Romania just joined the Allies in the middle of this offensive by the Russians. So
sucks for Germany.
Yeah, but now there's some good numbers to pay attention to. In July,
Seriously.
So before this happened, the war declaration of Romania happened in August. In July, there was 112 divisions of Germans on the Western Front and 52 in Russia. By November, there was 121 divisions in the West and 76 in the East. So if you noticed, these numbers went up, not down.
Seriously, yeah.
So instead of diverting large amounts of troops the Allies wanted, they would instead end up conscripting the entire generation of Germans from age 18 to 24 to reinforce their lines and cause a massive swell in their troop numbers.
Those poor men, though.
Very much so.
Just young men.
Yes. So the entire generation, which is now known as the Lost Generation, was conscripted into these fronts. So their numbers just they didn't double, but they went up a large amount, and which something the already outnumbered Allies were going to have a big problem with. So the original British Expeditionary Force was 6 divisions and 1 cavalry division. They had lost most of their pre-war regulars, as we talked about earlier. The bulk of their new army would have to be made of volunteers, and these would be from the Territorial Force, which was a part-time volunteer component of the British Army, started in 1904, kind of like how we do now in America. Like there's part-time Air Force and part-time Army people who you just work weekends basically in the military, which sounds weird, but it's real. Like it's a thing. You can be a part-time soldier. That's what the the territorial force was. And the majority, however, of this army would come from a force called Kitchener's Army. And this was a volunteer portion of the British military. I brought up a propaganda poster right now.
I actually do know about this guy.
Yeah, Lord Kitchener.
Yep.
Yeah, he kind of is like the Uncle Sam. But he was a real person. That's the difference. Yeah. Lord Kitchener decided to make an army. And this was a volunteer portion of the British Army formed in 1914 as a response against German aggression. So let's talk about Britain in 1916 and what that country is like at this time. The war in Europe had changed from a moving forward and backward conflict, as wars generally are, to a complete stagnant trench warfare stalemate. Britain had a massive social upheaval when Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, had called for a small 100,000 volunteer force to supplement the British Army. Recruitment stations were put up on street corners and propaganda posters were stuck all over every wall. Radio ads would constantly broadcast stories of how you could be a hero fighting for the king and advertised Kitchener's Army and how you can save your nation, right? That kind of stuff.
God save the king.
Yeah, exactly. And you think like Uncle Sam stuff is weird? Like it's weird when a king is involved. You know what I mean?
Right.
You're not talking about like serving your monarch. So that it worked. Over a month, lines to sign up would be seen wrapping around blocks from big cities to even small Scottish villages in the Highlands. The call was sent and it was answered by over 500,000 young men signing up for the war in the first month.
Good Lord. Well, that can tip the scales.
Yes. So this was higher than expected. So other politicians are like, oh my gosh, this might actually work. And around the country, they began putting their own efforts to push for Kitchener's Army. They started doing their own propaganda, their own radio ads. And it was hard to walk down a street in London without seeing 50 advertisements on the street, about trying to get men to sign up for the Kitchener's Army. And in the end, Kitchener's Army would recruit over 3 million men.
Jesus Christ. Yeah, it's like walking around down Los Angeles in like West Hollywood and just seeing Machine Gun Kelly posters everywhere.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God.
Yeah. Or walking in New York City when you go past the construction sites and there's just like posters everywhere. Like, they're splattered with them. Like that kind of thing was going on, but it was all join the army, serve your king. And many of these volunteer groups, were groups, sport clubs, chess clubs, village pub regulars, freshly graduated school kids looking to serve their country. They would all get together and sign up as a group. And when you did that, you would serve the whole war with your group. They would keep you with your with your friend group. Like you were like,
wow.
Yeah.
That's good for motivation, I guess.
Yeah, that's
see your friend
the
get taken
idea.
out, you're gonna. Yeah, I guess.
it was like everyone was able to like get together with your friends, go to war. You can stay with your friends in the trenches. And,
let's go,
have a great time. Yeah, exactly. Like, you know what? Let's get all our anime water friends to go fight. Yeah, like that's the idea. And it worked. Yeah. People did it. People were like, oh, come on, dear old chap. Let's stop playing chess and go play chess against the Germans in real war. It's like, okay, sure. Whatever you guys are into. It worked.
Yeah. Didn't by the way, this guy get taken out by a U-boat?
I don't know what happened to Kitchener. I don't know his fate. He's not going to be talked about again. He's the Secretary of War. I don't know if he ever left England, but he might have.
How do you spell his last name?
Kitchen with an ERS at the end, or no S. There's Kitchener.
Kitchener, World War I. Because I want to know how did he die?
Death of Lord Kitchener.
Yeah, death.
Does it say on Wikipedia?
Death, influence, decline, fall, and a shell crisis, and the failed.
It looked like it was at sea.
He drowned, yeah.
Yeah.
When his vessel, the HMS Hampshire, struck a mine. Oh, it was a mine. Okay. So I thought it was maybe a U-boat or something, but no, he drowned on January 5th. That sucks.
So, it sucks, but you know what? He did die in the war. And he was recruiting all these other men to die in the war, so I guess it kind of works out. You know what I mean?
It's kind of karma.
It kind of got everything.
Even though without what he did, the war might not have gone the way it did.
Yeah, it's just it happened.
Pick your poison, bitch. No,
I also pulled up a picture right now of the recruits, which we're actually going to talk about these recruits because there was a big problem with Kitchener's army, which was rapid expansion. Vacancies that were now existing for senior command, as well as specialist roles, because all these divisions were being created that didn't exist before, were now being filled by retired officers or inexperienced volunteers. So people who are assigned to lead have never led before, because you now have to organize 3 million men into divisions. Like that's a lot.
How do you vet that too? Like, do you just kind of have
absolutely,
interviews with like, hey,
absolutely not. No one was interviewed. People were signing up age 13 and saying they were 16 or saying they were 18. Like, there's a lot of stories of the kids who signed up because they wanted to serve their king and get out of school. You know what I mean? Like, it was like a thing, and most of them didn't make it back. 1% of them made it back. So, it's just, there was no vetting process. They just wanted more soldiers. And a good example of this problem is Sir Douglas Haig himself, the guy we were talking about earlier, who's in charge of the British.
Right.
In 1914, he was a lieutenant general in command of one corps of men, who then got promoted to commander of the First Army, who then was rapidly promoted to commander of the entire BEF, going from commanding one unit to commanding 5 armies with 60 divisions of men. So he went to commanding a unit, which is like 25 men, to commanding 60 divisions of men in like a year. Like, that's a big promotion. You know what I mean? Yeah. He went from like...
Probably not deserved, just desperate.
Oh, that's exactly what it was. They needed a person, and he was the most qualified, I guess, so they gave him the spot. Many officers in this Kitchener's army were just young adults or even teenagers who would have graduated from one of the Britain's many elite public schools and just immediately given leadership roles. Like you said, no vetting. Like, oh, you graduated a public school that was in North London? You're in. Like, that's a wealthy area. Good job. Like, you're smart. You're smart. You graduated high school. You're in. Like, that was it. And as this picture you can see on the stream I have right now, you can Google it yourself if you want, but just Kitchener's Army soldiers. There was a massive shortage of uniforms, rifles, and many other equipment. So recruits would train and go day to day wearing civilian clothes. Rifles would be substituted with walking sticks and drills, and the officers would often lose track of their men due to their lack of uniform. Like, because they just blended in with everyone else in the street. Right, and this was caused, of course, by the rapid expansion. They needed more men. They needed had a large amount of inexperienced commanders as a result, as well as an acute supply shortage. Most men would not even get their full kit until the week they arrived at the Somme. So they would show up uniformless and get their gun and uniform at the battlefield.
Oh my God, that's encouraging.
Yeah. So it's a lot to ask for a nation to suddenly train, arm, clothe, and feed hundreds of thousands of men on extremely short notice. Like, that's a big task. Back to the German side of things. The staff officers were fiercely debating about how to progress their war because they're in troubles, like we said. And Erich von Falkenhayn, who we talked about earlier, continued the policy of unyielding defense in 1916. He would imply, after the war, that the psychology of German soldiers, shortage of manpower, and lack of reserves made the policy inescapable, as the troops required to seal off any kind of breakthrough in the lines of defense simply did not exist. He would state that high losses incurred by holding ground by a policy of no retreat were preferable to higher losses via voluntary withdrawals via small offenses. So the Germans were already fighting a war of attrition against themselves at this stage.
That happens quite a few times to those guys.
So they weren't doing good. Like, they were winning the war territory wise, but they were kind of like, damn, these allies keep getting more men and keep getting more guns, and we're not doing that.
Yeah, I mean, if there's anything that Europeans don't like, it's being subjugated by somebody else. Yeah,
and some of the later end of the war battles that would happen, the supply shortages were starting to get filled by the Ottoman Empire sending stuff to the Germans, but we'll talk about that another time. But for this point, that hadn't happened yet. There was no Ottoman arms coming in.
Right.
Following this plan of extreme defense, Falkenhayn began to construct, which you're going to bring up a picture of right now. These two pictures. He began to construct on 1915 on the Somme front a trench network that was completed in 1916. Barbed wire obstacles had been enlarged using double and triple thick wire and 5-foot spools covering the entire length of the trenches. The line had been increased from one single trench to 3 lines, about 150 to 200 yards apart. The first trench would be occupied by the Kampfgraden, or sentry troops. These would be men who have either drawn the short straw or were punished for one reason or another from other divisions, because the sentry's job was to poke your head above the trench and keep a lookout for incoming attacks. And they often would fall victim to sniper fire, but mostly the artillery barrages that could hit the front line because they were in range.
Right.
The second trench would be the bulk of the front trench garrison, the troops who would be responsible for defense of the line or any kind of pushback to take the first trench if needed. The third trench would be for local reserve troops, and also where some troops would be rotated to after serving long stretches at the front or being injured. Trenches would have sentry posts in concrete recesses, and dugouts had been deepened from 6 to 9 feet, which was the old trenchway, to 20 to 30 feet, and would be 50 yards apart, large enough to fit 25 men comfortably. These were where troops would sleep at night and take cover from barrages, and with these now 30-foot deep dugouts, artillery shells could not reach that level.
Yeah, the staircases look pretty good.
Yep, that's exactly what it is. That's going to a dugout.
You have to have a direct hit.
So you can see by these pictures and the description I just made, if you're just listening, there's wooden walls holding up the sides, there's concrete barriers, there's barbed wire, there's staircases going down. They're structures. These aren't pits dug in the mud. These are now structured trenches, fully defensible positions.
They'd have to take literally direct line hit in order to get damage, instead of just if you could hit outside, it'd still be okay.
Yeah, and there's one other big advantage they did, which comes from the reserve line. They would be built the same at the very back and have solid communication to the front via a revolutionary technology of telephone wire. The second line was also ranged to be outside of artillery range and have telephones so they could contact the other lines, forcing the British to move their guns forward to assault the second line where the troops were held if they wanted to hit it. And which also put them in range of the German artillery in the back. So they were built specifically at a distance apart to draw British forces forward, and the moment that happened, they just picked up a phone. So this was the most advanced and well-defended trench ever made in the war. And
it sounds genius. Every aspect. They covered their bases from defense to offense.
Yeah, it's like I was kind of saying. Falkenhayn was like, we just need to play defense. 100%. So they just went full points in defense. They specialized in defense and they just went in there. I have a picture of a British trench to compare.
Great.
So that picture I just brought up now is a British trench. You can just Google search Somme British trench. So the French and British trenches, on the other hand, would be very standard style, which were zigzag lines with sandbags and barbed wire, and even just bushes they could find and other debris in the battlefield to make cover at the top. The trenches were in a zigzag shape, so if you got into it, you couldn't shoot down the trench. You had to turn around.
You had to maneuver.
Yeah.
Shotguns were a thing.
Exactly. Shotguns weren't a thing yet at this time.
Right.
In Battlefield. The Americans did it. The Americans brought the shotgun to the First World War, which changed everything.
You're welcome, everybody.
Yeah, basically. The trenches were made, however, on the British side, intentionally to not be effective at the Somme. The defense manual of the British Army would state, quote, "The choice of a defensive position and its preparation must be made with a view on economizing the power expended on defense in order that the power of offense may be increased." End quote. So basically, don't tire yourself out making trenches, because we're just going to assault them and win anyway, right, guys? Moving on. All this time, the Somme had been quiet. All the stuff we've talked about, this battle hasn't started yet. We're 40 minutes into the episode. The battle hasn't started yet.
We're just building up, baby.
Yes.
Let's go.
The Somme had been
sad, actually.
It is sad, but the Somme had been quiet. The troops were there in the thing. Hey, okay, let's just make a disclaimer right now. It's okay to be hyped for old battles that already happened in a historical sense. Like, you can enjoy the history of warfare. It doesn't mean you support war. You know what I mean? It's completely different.
Yes.
Completely different.
Yes, agreed. I was just kind of teasing it a little bit.
Just looking back on this stuff is amazing, which is what I like to do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's amazing that this shit happens. Like,
so the Somme British soldiers had never experienced trench warfare. France was losing a lot of people at Verdun and desperately needed the attack of the Somme to begin. On the 16th of June, the objectives and the offensive as a relief of pressure for Verdun were made clear. By the 24th of June, everything at the Somme would change. Over the next 7 days, the Germans were to feel the impact of over 1.5 million shells falling around them from the British artillery.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. That's a lot of ammunition.
Can't count that on one hand or two.
No, you need a couple group of people to do that. British field artillery was made of 18-pounders, which used 4.5-inch howitzer shells, which were used for trench demolition. Further back, they had the heavy artillery, which were 15-inch howitzers, which would be used to hit German gun emplacements. And
my dad calls girls with big boobs howitzers.
I love that. That is one of the most sexist, obscure things. It's such an obscure thing.
He doesn't say it to them.
Right. I get
me,
it. Yeah.
And then I turn beat red and cringe.
Dad, stop. Isn't the trenches of Verdun? Stop.
Yeah, I should say that. I should say that next time.
Anyway. At the front of the British lines, they had troops with field mortars that would try to knock out weaker defenses. So like machine gun nests, basically.
Right, yeah.
From the 26th of June onward, the British began using chlorine gas shells to launch chemical attacks on the German lines. At this time of war, gas was used regularly. It had been used. We talked about it a little bit at the Verdun, but it was used heavier at the Somme than Verdun, and it was used by both sides. So a lot of people like to think that the Allies did not use gas. That's not true. We used plenty of gas. We shelled the Germans with gas at the Somme. But by 1916, there was a massive shortage of chlorine gas, and it was mostly being saved for the day before the offensive to advance over no man's land.
Right.
And we didn't talk about this in Verdun because I wanted to talk about it during Somme. Let's talk about what happens during a gas attack. Let's just say you don't have your gas mask on you at the time.
Grab a pillow, grab some popcorn, snuggle up, and let's
talk about gas attacks. So gas would spread very quickly, and if it was windy, it would spread twice as fast. And it made a light white cloud, and you could smell it. It smelled like chemicals. It was described as a smell of chemical burn. And you would smell this chemical coming in, and if you smell it without your gas mask on, sorry, pal, you're done. At first, you feel dizzy and thirsty.
Oof.
What the gas is doing in your body is liquefying your insides slowly and dissolving your organs. And you start to cough up blood, which is pieces of your insides coming out. If you drink water because of the thirst, it speeds it up 100 times. Because this water is now mixing with the chlorine gas, and you're now making chlorine liquid gas in your body, like turning from gas to liquid chemicals in your body. So it liquefies your insides, and you quickly die. And many veterans would recall seeing bodies of gas attack victims being in rigor mortis, horrifying positions of screaming in pain, and their skin turned green.
Jesus Christ!
So that's why it's a war crime. Because it was invented and used heavily in the First World War, and troops didn't have enough gas masks to go around. So
I mean, this is one of the things we talked about with World War I, was that this was a war where everyone just did everything they possibly could to kill and win.
Yeah.
So they're discovering all this stuff. A lot of this stuff is just brand new. So they're let's try it out.
The Germans at the time also would use their Flammenwerfers, or flamethrower, which on the British side was what? The British side during the Somme was their first use of the flamethrower. So they now had their own flame weapons to burn everyone to death in trenches, which makes it great time. So just throwing that out there, that was being used at this time.
If Mass Effect's taught me anything, though, all you gotta do is one nice, well-placed shot to that tank,
and it pops. That doesn't work. much in real life. But it will cause the flamethrower to stop working, so it does do stuff. I think if it's firing at the time, it might explode. I think I remember seeing that that's not real. Like that was like a big video game myth.
Well, it's me using incendiary rounds, everybody.
Yeah, just throw your fire at one. So during this time, the British lack of experience was to be compensated by sheer number. That was their plan. The men would be organized into lines of no more than 100 yards apart and advance along a front of 15 miles. That was how long the British Somme front was.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. As they advanced, they would be protected by a creeping barrage of artillery fire ahead of them to soften the German line. The infantry were led to believe that their journey across no man's land would be little more than a stroll due to the heavy damage done by the British artillery this past week. Most of the British men were excited, looking for a chance to test their manhood and take on the evil Germans in an easy victory and earn glory for the king.
I test my manhood by lifting weights, and that's about it.
You should go to war.
Okay.
Yeah, easy. After the artillery bombardment, the British Fourth Army was to capture their mission was to capture 27,000 yards of the German front line, and the Third Army was to make a divisionary assault around the sides. The second phase of the battle's plan was to have the Fourth Army show up and take out, which did their initial capturing. They would go forward and take the German second line they had dug out, and then ready for an assault on the third. Then the 3 cavalry divisions would exploit the success of advancements and go from the east and the north towards the Arras and clear out the Somme. Easy, right?
Yeah, I mean, whatever, man. That's a breeze.
Easy, right?
I could do that in my sleep. I could do it in my sleep, pussy.
So I didn't talk about battle tactics ever done at all, and I only bring this up now because they wrote it down so matter-of-factly. I thought it was almost like cringy. And they thought it was just going to be like so fucking easy. Like, oh yeah, they're just going to roll over their trenches, and the cavalry will do a classic like medieval style battle plan from the sides and flank them.
Oh god.
So unfortunately, the Germans had just completed their third defensive position right before this battle, the artillery started, which covered an additional 3,000 yards back from the previous one that had begun being dug out in February, making their defensive even stronger. They also had a 6-foot deep telephone lines now on every single part of the trench, which was revolutionary, as I mentioned before, because the British were using pigeons at the time. The German line, however, did have 2 massive weaknesses. Firstly, was nature itself. The trenches were on a forward slope, which exposed white chalk in the subsoil, making the line highly visible from across the field.
Oh.
So the British could see it without even binoculars. They could see their trench. Secondly, the defenses were overcrowded with troops at the front, and due to visibility of the line, they could be zeroed in by artillery strikes by the British.
Oh wow, okay.
So
that's
big flaw. They didn't know what was happening because they didn't look at the line from the front. So they didn't know that was going on. Exactly. You can't stand up. So that's it. Like you're in there. So with this all set up, it's time to go to part 2, the Battle of the Somme.
Let's go. It's time to happen.
So it's starting now. The day was the 1st of July, 1916. British whistles were sounded, and the men climbed out of their trenches and began to advance behind a British artillery barrage moving up the field. The Battle of the Somme had officially began. And as they advanced...
Congratulations, everybody.
Yeah, we did it. We made it, guys. All your organization is now going to pay off excellently, as you'll find out. A German defensive barrage immediately began in the field at the same time as the British offensive barrage. And I'm going to start off describing this with a quote. Each line disappeared in a thick cloud of dust and smoke, which rapidly blotted out the whole area. I saw a few groups of men through the gaps in the cloud, but I knew no man could survive such a fire. The whole brigade was wiped out. This is a quote from Brigadier H.S. Rees, whose brigadier of North English friends from a pub who signed up together went into the Somme together, and after this day, he would be the only survivor.
Man, that is sad.
A sergeant of the 3rd Irish Division would say, I could see a way to my left and to my right, long lines of men. Then I heard the patter-patter of the machine guns in the distance. By the time I had gone 10 yards, there were only a few men around me. By the time I had gone to 20, I was alone. Then I was hit myself.
Jesus Christ.
Those who would survive...
He didn't die. Yeah,
no, he didn't die at that time. I don't know if he survived the war. There's no name for this quote, so we don't know what happened to him. But he said this at the hospital, I'm guessing. Those who would survive the barrage would be met with harsh machine gun fire. All along the front, it was the same story of universal carnage. The only success was the veteran French units, who managed to push through with the British fighting alongside them and take ground they were tasked to do.
Right.
By 9 a.m., most of the British troops who had made it through the barrage and found cover were now cut off from their own artillery force. They were stranded as German artillery was now hitting behind them. And on top of that, Germans could easily locate the train of British troops and take them out with mortars and hand grenades. Moving to the rear meant falling victim to the artillery and the machine gun fire, and moving forward meant German rifles and grenades. The British troops needed...
so scary.
Yes.
So scary.
They had a way out, the British, which was what they were trying to do. They tried to signal their artillery, strike where we're at, right in front of us. And to do this, they had discs, flags, and carrier pigeons to send messages back to the artillery, but none of these would prove effective. Flags and discs were too hard to see at distance, and all the smoke and dust from the artillery strikes.
Right.
Pigeons were a primary target for German snipers and field riflemen, and would get shot the moment they were released. Some would manage to send runners back to the artillery line and actually make it, but 9 out of 10 would die trying to run back.
Right.
9 corps of the French 6th Army and the British 4th and the 3rd Army and the British 3rd Army, attacked the German 2nd Army across the River Somme. They would manage to make progress and capture both sides of the river in the area. The German defense, however, south of the road was mostly collapsing, allowing the British to take both banks of the Somme River. So progress had been made on this first day.
Believe it or not, folks.
But at a great cost. The bulk of the force, was being the 3rd Corps, at the attack on the Albert Bapaume Road, was a disaster, making it only a short distance and suffered large casualties in a very short time. So this battle already was being decided by British artillery. Men would have to climb out of the trench, carry 66 pounds of equipment across no man's land, with nothing but the hope that the artillery did enough damage to stop them from getting destroyed. British intelligence, on the other hand, was horrible, and they had no idea the power of the German defense at this point. While many divisions would make ground and do some progress, this battle was off to a horrific start. Several truces would even be called between both sides to recover the wounded. Later in the afternoon, the German would counterattack and push back, taking back some of the lost ground, but not a lot. But this would cause greater casualties for the Allied forces. On the first day of battle of the Somme, the Germans would suffer 10,000 casualties, with the French suffering 1,590. The British would suffer a devastating 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 dead.
That's so fucking ridiculous.
The British were told to win at any cost, and the officers took that very literally. And at the end of the first day, the British lost 60% of their force.
My goodness. Hey, Britain wants you, everybody. Go fight for the king.
Yeah, talk about a Pyrrhic victory. They took you took some ground, but at the loss of 60% of your people. Acting Corporal Rupert Weber would recount the event as, quote, "As far as you could see, there were all these bodies laying out there, literally thousands of them, some without legs, some legs without bodies, arms without bodies. It was a terrible sight to see." End quote. For those who were tasked to bury the dead, the job was extremely traumatizing, as carts would be brought in nonstop throughout the next days, wheeling the bodies of deads, including just parts. Most of the bodies shredded to pieces. A soldier was quoted saying, quote, "The dead were stretched out on one side, on top of each other 6 foot high. I thought at the time I shall never get the peculiar disgusting smell of the vapor of warm human blood heated by the sun out of my nostrils. I would rather have smelled gas 100 times. End quote.
Jesus.
That quote stuck with me. The description of the vapor of warm human blood heated by the sun.
Yeah, it's like I'm trying to. Well, I'm not trying to imagine it, but like, you just the sun can heat things, and when
Yeah.
you put a egg on the ground and it sizzles and stuff.
And imagine how
Anyway,
hot it would be with these bodies with like explosions going off around them.
right.
And there probably was literal fires burning in the field too. So it's like there's just like it's a mess. And the worst part was at the night of the first day, the men had to hear what would be known as the Demon's Choir. This would be the babbling screams and moans of the dying in no man's land.
There's nothing you can do about it.
The men had to sit in the trenches, clutching their rifles, while hearing their friends feet away screaming for help, or just in pain of their slow, agonizing deaths.
Right.
A Lieutenant Horshaw would say it sounded like, quote, wet fingers stretching across an enormous pane of glass.
Oh God. That's so these guys are really poetic.
Oh, well, we're actually going to talk about that in a moment.
Okay.
Stretcher parties were braving the perils of the German machine guns to rescue wounded as best they could, but they had almost no effect because there was literally thousands of wounded dying on the field. And despite the little victories of the day, it will be ever seen in history as a disaster that Haig and Joffre will be criticized for the rest of their lives. They had no intelligence the depths of the German defense and how many gun emplacements were masked, hidden by the Germans. Much of the British ammunition were made of duds that can still be found today in the dirt. And a lot of them would explode in the barrel of the guns, destroying the barrels of their large artillery cannons. The majority of the shells used by the British were 18-pound shrapnel shells, which can hardly even affect the double-thick wire the Germans were using.
Jesus.
Let alone
Wow.
the triple-thick kinds. So they were using
Right,
shrapnel.
yeah, God.
So like it would explode and send metal chunks out, which isn't going to cut triple-thick barbed wire. Like,
Sure.
it's just going to get caught up in it and make it even more dangerous. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
Right.
the creeping artillery barrage meant to protect the men also was a huge failure. The artillery men were inexperienced and had never fired artillery before, and had made less than accurate shots and fired the guns too slowly, and the British advance would have to stand and stop moving out of fear of getting hit by their own men, and this made the German have the knowledge of the attacking men and where they were wave upon wave, and them seeing them standing in the field waiting for the next friendly barrage. The infantry attacking knew the barbed wire was still up, which was supposed to have been destroyed by the previous days of shelling. And due to the high casualty rate and the terror of those who had survived, this kept not getting reported.
Oh.
This
God.
meant that the officers assumed there were many gaps in their defense when in reality there wasn't any, and would keep ordering their troops to attack areas in the lines that they had no way in. So,
There's just
pretty
right.
fucked up times going on for the British. But that was just day one. From the 2nd to the 13th, more attacks would be made, and the progress was slowly being made onto the German lines by the British forces. On the 14th, a British superior surprise offensive would be planned, an attack to finally try to launch a second massive assault like the first, but with the new intelligence and knowledge of the strength of the German line. This assault would begin in a surprise offensive against the Germans while they slept at 3:25 a.m., and would successfully overrun 5 miles of the German front. The attack was a massive success, and then the side of the battlefield was subject to heavy cavalry charge by the British Cavalry Division. So the British,
Man.
we're going to talk about it. The British sent in horses. Their cavalry division charged, and I want to be clear, with lances against the German
Really?
flanks.
Really?
But guess what Germans had? Machine guns.
Guns.
Every single horse died.
Right.
And
Of course they did. Poor fucking things.
machine guns are very good at killing things, especially men on horses. And they weren't quiet,
Right.
so they
Big
knew they were
giant
coming.
targets.
You can feel the cavalry charge coming, so they just mowed it down in literal minutes. They killed the entire cavalry division. And this would be the last time modern military would have a cavalry charge. And the age of the horse in war was officially over.
Good.
So it was that Battle of the Somme, the last cavalry charge. Now, did the Polish charge the Germans the cavalry? Yes, but that's not. I don't count that because that wasn't like an organized offensive.
Right. That wasn't like a planned thing. Like, don't worry. Then we're going to hit him with cavalry.
Yeah.
There had to have been somebody in that meeting that was like, "You're shitting me, right, sir?"
I don't think so. They thought they were the shit. They thought the cavalry was like still the weapon, and they're like, "Oh, guess they don't run faster than bullets."
They're fucking stupid for thinking.
Yeah.
that.
Oh, 100%. I mean, you know how dumb these officers were. They never saw battle. They were hiding in their country houses, talking about it and going, "Oh, good lad," and talking
Give
about
me the whiskey, please.
the king of England and Britain would literally talk to the Kaiser, his cousin, during the war about the battles.
Right, yeah.
Like it was just a game to them.
Yeah. God
But
damn it, dude. These people are fucked.
yeah, so with that battle, they did win the battle. The cavalry all just died. But with that was the end of the first phase of the Somme. The British were taking their objectives, but then realized they had severely underestimated the German defenses. The inexperienced British soldiers were evident, and their knowledge of trench warfare was now being learned as they fought. The attackers of the Somme were outnumbered 2-1, and had managed to push back the Germans due to their refusal to attack following Falkenhayn's plans. But most of the German forces simply moved back as opposed to being killed, so they were still heavily outnumbered.
Right. Yeah, retreat is always it's a good thing.
They retreated,
not a bad
exactly.
idea.
The Germans couldn't afford to lose men like we talked about earlier, so they just retreated over everything else. The next big battle would be the Battle of the Formels, which would be from the 19th to the 20th during the Somme. Of the July, sorry, which would see the debut of the Australian Imperial Forces on the Western Front.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So they got some reinforcements from Australia, and they would be a huge boon for the Allies, making up most of the lost men from the previous battles of the Somme, while their new recruits came in from Britain still.
Let's go. Come on, everybody.
Oh,
We're
yeah,
from
mate.
we're from a dangerous place.
Take on Jerry, eh? Unfortunately for everyone, the Battle of Formals would soon be known forever to Australians as the worst 24 hours in Australia's history.
Oh, dang. Fucking the Great Emu War's got nothing on this.
Yeah, the Australians were pretty good fighters.
I mean, they grew up in Australia, so they gotta be.
Yeah, like they were pretty strong. They kind of knew what they were doing. But at the Battle of Formels, there would be 7,080 casualties. 5,533 of them were the 5th Australian Division, with German losses only being between 1,600 and 2,000.
Oh, god damn. Sorry, Australia.
And we could do a whole episode on Formels. We're going to definitely talk more about the Anzac forces in a future episode, because they were huge in World War One. They don't know, Australia was a major faction in the war. They did a lot of work, and this is like one of the worst losses they had, hence them being known as worst 24 hours of Australian history.
Right.
But the battle could be a whole episode, like I mentioned, of just the intelligence failure, horrible losses over a minor gain of ground that would cost thousands of lives. It was an important development in the overall campaign of the Somme, however, due to the additional help of Australians on the Allies that still remained after this battle. So now they had Australian backup, which is big.
Right.
The Somme would see another moment in military history at the Battle of Flers-Croisset, I think is how you say it.
I had one of those for breakfast this morning.
Yeah, there you go. In 1916, this battle would take place. And in this battle, we're going to bring a picture up right now why. 49 giant metal behemoths with cannons and machine guns mounted on it with large treads to propel them over battlefields would make their world debut. The first tanks. With a crew of 8 men stuffed inside the box, who would endure intense heat of the engines, were meant to take out the enemy machine gun emplacements with their 6-pounder cannons, and then engage personnel with 2 Vickers machine guns, one on each side. Their debut, however, was not a stellar showing from the British perspective. Living inside these monsters who would move at max 3 miles per hour was not easy, and they quickly learned some lessons for future tankers. Each tank was equipped with a pigeon for sending messages back to the Allied lines, and the first tankers would often lose their pigeons due to extreme heat or engine fumes.
Right.
The men would wear normal helmets inside, right? Turns out this was a huge mistake. Most of them would go blind in their first battle. And the reason for this was due to heavy small arms fire from German machine guns and rifles. While they would take little to no damage from this, the bullets would melt on impact of the tank, causing streaks of silvery colored lead, which could be seen all over the sides of these tanks. The gunners would fall victim to the liquid, the melting, splashing into their eyes through the crevices, permanently blinding them and often killing them too.
Right.
Soon, the tanker helmet was invented, which you can look up. If you look up World War I tanker helmet, it's like a normal pith helm with a chain mask, and they had a chain almost like sheet hanging off the edge of the helmet, and underneath that they would have goggles and a mask.
Yeah, I just looked it up. They kind of look scary.
Yeah, they do look scary. They look scary as hell. But that would stop this from happening in the future. Overall, at this battle, 17 tanks would fail to reach the line. 14 would break down or stall in the mud, and only 9 tanks would survive to clear a path for the infantry. And while they did make an impact of the battle and cause victory for sure, their biggest victory was the psychology of the German soldiers. This was terrifying for Germans. They had no idea what the fuck these things were. They had no intelligence on these before they showed up. And these giant mechanical beasts were now being were spreading fear at the German forces. And they were terrified of them. No weapon truly existed to battle these at this time. Anti-material rifles would soon show up along with anti-tank mines, but at the time, they didn't have anything. They literally could not fight the tanks. And by late September, the Germans had been pushed back 3 miles, and the conditions of the Somme were atrocious. Little could be seen through rain and the mist in the air, so scout planes had no visibility. The ground was covered in miles of mud. To move one 18-pounder artillery, they would have to use 12 horses.
Jesus Christ.
The thick mud would also hide bodies, and sometimes these bodies would pop up, rotting and giving off the horrid smell of putricide that would spread amongst the troops, making them feel sick and vomit.
Right. Oh, God.
They basically created a swamp in this area.
Jesus Christ. Man-made swamps, everybody.
Yeah. In the air, we're going to talk about another part of technology in World War I, which we didn't talk about in the first one, which was the British Air Force. They were highly active at the Somme and would take many photographs during the clearing of the mist they could, but also attack German weather balloons and make note of their supply routes pushing back into Belgium and French territory, and take photos of the roads and where the Germans are moving their supplies.
Right.
So they would also, however, engage Germans in aerial dogfighting, a new style of warfare that had just started a few years ago. And aerial combat in the First World War was akin to knights dueling in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I've seen footage of it.
Yeah, ace pilots were thought of as heroes and celebrated and given medals, and they were heavily praised with their kills in battle and met with respect even by their enemies. They would often have kill markings in their planes and custom heraldry, and it was a very big deal. They literally were knights. Knights in the Sky is like I think it's a book about World War I. Like they were treated like heroes, basically.
Yeah.
And it was very hard to fly a plane.
I actually loved I always loved the stories of like early pilots and stuff, because I always thought it was like the technology is so brand new and they're already using it to blow each other up. It's just it's fucking crazy.
Which, we're going to talk about right now. We're going to go a little bit into air combat. And we're going to start with one of the aces of the battle. Which, up the sleeve of the British, you could say an ace up their sleeve, was an ace pilot named Lano Hawker. Hawker was a celebrated ace that was credited for 7 victories and would fly a British Bristol Scout C, a plane that had no working synchronizer gear. Do you know what a synchronizer gear is?
I don't.
It's a piece of equipment that would stop the propeller from spinning during machine gun fire, which allowed planes to fire forward without shooting their own propeller.
Oh, so okay, yeah. I mean, I didn't know that's what it was called, but I knew that technology existed.
Yeah, they had technology that when you pull the trigger of your gun, the propeller would stop during you pulling it, and you had to keep letting go during bursts, or else you would fall. So his plane that he had been successful with had a machine gun mounted to the left of the cockpit that he would fire, that would only fire sideways and forward at a 45-degree angle, avoiding the propeller. So this meant he could only attack enemies in their right rear quarter, and he managed to win many battles despite this, and he would earn the Victoria Cross for his great success. That's his plane, by the way, underneath it. I just pulled a picture of that. You can look it up. The Lord Hawker's number 16611 Bristol Scout C was his plane he flew in. So during the Somme, Hawker would show up and lead multiple scout recon missions. This time, he would be flying an Airco DH-2, which was nicer, had a synchronizer gear, and would allow him to fire forward, and would mostly be responsible for recon, but sometimes they would be met with German opposition in the sky, as the Germans would see you fly over and they would, scramble their planes. On the 23rd of November in 1916, Hawkers would be part of a group known as A Flight that took off at 1300 hours, led by Captain J.O. Andrews, who would soon become Air Vice Marshal, and Lieutenant, later Air Marshal, Air HMS Sonby. Andrews would lead the fight in an attack on 2 German aircraft they saw, and Hawkers began to dive for them in the battle, and Andrews and Sonby would follow. The ace... These guys weren't aces, by the way. Hawker was officially an ace. So they were like, we're going to follow this guy into battle. So they followed him in, and they did their best to cover him. Andrew drove one of the classes off, but would take damage to his engine and managed to glide back down, safely landing on friendly lines, under the cover fire from Sonby. So now it was 2-on-2. Hawker had been, flying around chasing the Germans, and began combat with a German Albatros D-11, flown by the picture I just brought up by none other than Lieutenant Manfred von Richthofen, which I'll bring up a picture of his plane in color, because that man is no other than the Red Baron.
Oh, I love his pizza.
He makes great pizzas. What he did during this battle, however, was quickly outmaneuver Hawkers, and with a pair of his powerful IMG-08 machine guns, fired 900 rounds during the dogfight in total. Running low on fuel, Hawker couldn't keep fighting, had to break away, and the Baron fired a one last burst before both his guns would jam, forcing him out of the fight as well. And during that one last burst, a bullet would strike Hawker in the head, killing him instantly. This would be the Baron's 11th victim, as he would soon rise to the famous rank of the greatest pilot of all time, and would raise German morale heavily, and the loss of Hawker caused a massive blow to British pride and their knights in the sky.
Yeah, I bet.
So during this, battle, the RFC would lose 782 aircraft over the course of the Somme, only destroying 164 German aircraft and forcing down 205. So that seems like a disaster, number-wise.
Right.
But historical analysis says this is a huge success and may have changed the course of the Somme forever, because the cause of the British side's mass air casualties was constantly pushing past the German front line, and what this meant was the Germans couldn't get their scout planes out over the battlefield the entire time. The British never stopped pushing their air. They were just in German airspace the whole time. And so it just meant they never got intelligence in the sky. And they never let any balloons go up. And any time a German scout plane would show up, they would be taken out before they could get back. So this gave... what was that?
I was going to say, just that's the kind of sacrifice that really pays off. I don't know what else to say. Yeah,
it was bad, but yeah, that was actually I think the Somme. I'm not going to put up a screen. I have a slideshow of pictures coming because I think no specific ones coming up for the rest of this. But that would actually be the battle that would make the Red Baron basically paint his plane red. It wasn't painted red before that.
Oh.
So
he probably shouldn't have done that either, because I feel like that just makes him a target, but whatever.
He did die because of it. He was chased after, and it got him killed. But we don't know who killed the Red Baron. It's like a debate. Really? Huh. A bunch of people claim credit for it, so it's pretty sure it was Canadians. But
way to go.
They took out the Red Baron. They also thought he wasn't dead because his plane landed, but he was shot physically in the cockpit and died.
Got it. Good job, Soundwave.
But he was given a full burial with rights, a hero's burial by the Allies. That's how much they respected these pilots.
Right. Yeah. I do understand. Yeah. Of course.
They're like, damn, this guy was the best. He's the enemy, but he was the best. So.
Yeah. And then he got a pizza named after him.
He got a whole pizza brand. So. Yeah, air superiority changed the course of the battle, and this would be the first time basically in history that this would happen, and it turns out this is how you win any battle ever. Still today, air superiority. And the British were able to have a full range of scout planes taking photos, as well as bombers over the Somme, giving them aerial dominance despite their heavy losses. By mid-October, it was obvious the big push was coming to a squelching halt. The British would try their best to charge, usually going against their own rules of engagement. Infantry were wet to the skin through their uniforms due to heavy rain and mud, and be condemned to charge forward into more mud, which had been fully obscured by already vague objectives that they couldn't see anymore, meaning they had no idea where they were going. Many of the men were beginning to lose faith in their leaders. And I have a quote.
Yeah, I bet.
A quote here. Quote, "The first day of the battle had brought substantial progress. We got our first thrust well home, and there's every reason to be sanguine about the result." That is a quote from the Times by none other than Sir Haig himself. And the papers on the front line would be met with shock from troops who knew this was not the case, and that the first day was a horrible disaster. And we have a quote from a man named C.L. Montague, who would write, quote, "Those who lived through the massacre read the stuff with mouth open. No amount of cynicism at the front could match the gall of those who wrote about the war from their country houses." End quote. Which basically, kind of like we were saying earlier, the men knew this was all bullshit.
Right.
We talked about it a lot during Verdun, too. Like, he literally said it, talking about the war from their country houses. Like, you don't know shit. You're home being an asshole.
Sipping on your whiskey.
Yeah, exactly.
Coffee, waking up at 9.
Looking at reports, so, send them in here, and then not realizing how horrible it was. Quote, "The open air life, the regular feeding, the exercise, and the freedom from care and responsibility keep the soldiers of the front feeling fit and content," end quote. Was another line from the Times. This time from the owner of the Times, Lord Northcliffe, when writing about life in the trenches.
He's a liar.
Yeah. So the truth, as we know, is that these poorly trained soldiers, who were now combat veterans, were holding out on nothing but patriotism and faith in the institution for which they fought. And most of that was now being ripped apart as they were ordered to take no prisoners, which would do nothing but lower morale.
Great.
The press, however, would soon find the voice of the troops in those that were known as the war poets, such as Robert Grave, Rupert Brooke, and Wilfred Owens, and others. So there is famous poems from the war about the Somme, like Flanders Fields, which is a very huge poem and a book of poems about stuff. And these people would write these poems, and they were song and poem, some were songs, and they were giving intense descriptions of pain and suffering, giving very vivid views of the horrors of war, but they were just romantic enough to be popular enough and published in newspapers back home.
That's pretty good, though. That's what art is, baby.
Yeah. So they were giving a message, but they were able to keep it like enough that they could publish it, And most of these men would
like, we're getting bloody shot to death and fucking scatter our brains everywhere. It's
yeah.
Like, no.
It was like, oh, the red and the poppies could be seen a mile away. Like that's like how they would say there's blood all over the fucking floor.
Right.
Of those men I mentioned, only one would survive the war. Most of the war poets did not survive the Somme. Of the group, there's like 12 war poets. I think 3 lived. Haig had, by October, decided that the German lines could not be pierced, and they would be dug in here until spring. Joffre, however, his superior, had a different plan, and pressured Haig to keep going. And Haig had planned a final assault on the Somme as a result of this. An area that had become nothing but a quagmire, miles of mud, and rancid acid water from dirty rain from the dead bodies and chemical weapons.
Yay!
Were just everywhere. Literally just a toxic field of death. The mud however, would change. Because on November 9th, the air cleared almost as if a miracle, and the skies were open as an early frost fell, which would solidify the mud and the water.
Oh, that's good.
So now they had solid dirt, and the final assault would begin 4 days later, half an hour before dawn. By this time, the British forces were now battle-hardened, and most of the troop would follow now very accurate creeping barrages of artillery due to their expert artillery shooters now. The troops would make it across no man's land and into the German line. The Germans would hold the fortified town of Serre, but every other area of the Somme was taken by the British during this final assault. But November 18th, the Battle of the Somme officially was over as Serre fell to the French advances. The Allies would advance over 6 miles the whole battle. This whole time it had been 6 miles.
That's really not that much.
No, it's not. With each mile would be paid for by over 100,000 casualties.
Good God.
By the end of the battle, the territory gained by the Allies would, however, indeed prove to be extremely vital to the future victory of the war, and would actually be the entry point for the Americans' offensive into the Ural later, the next year.
We're always late, but baby, when we show up, let's go.
We show up, we win. This caused a large break in the German lines by them taking the Somme. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, this battle has the most casualties of any single battle in the First War, which we're now going to go over the numbers. The French would suffer 200,000 casualties.
God damn it.
The British would suffer 420,000 casualties. And the German would suffer a devastating 434,000 to 445,000 casualties.
Christ.
In the Second World War, for example, the British lost 360,000 men in the entirety of World War II. So comparing that to this battle.
That's such a great example of like how, again, we were talking about it earlier, just like how brutal this war was.
Yeah.
And that way of like they used all the different kinds of weapons, all these new types of weapons between poison and planes and doing stupid shit like cavalry charges, whereas like in World War II, it's like, okay, guys, let's not fuck this up, let's do this a little bit right,
Yeah, so. And if you also, if you like poetry and you're into that, reading the war poet stuff is extremely depressing. Like it is. They were very good. They were very good writers, and it is disturbing and depressing to read because you know what they're talking about, and now we know the truth past the propaganda. So it's just like, Jesus Christ. Like they're just talking about seeing their friends' bodies rotting in the sun and smelling it and like all that shit. Because we didn't talk about trench warfare during this episode, but everything that was happening that we talked about in the Verdun episode during the trench warfare with the bodies piling up and the disease and the rats was happening here too.
Right, of course.
So
naturally.
Yeah. The Somme was a military disaster, but it was a victory that did change the war. So it's at least, unlike Verdun, its success meant something.
Right, it wasn't just a war bingo, or battle.
It was a very strategic victory that the Germans clearly did not want to give up because they did end up losing the most. During the whole time, it seemed like they weren't losing men, but in the end, they did lose a lot more than anyone else. And the biggest effect, something you brought up earlier, because of the high loss of dead, again, just this battle alone, 420,000 British men died. That was an entire generation of young men from entire villages and towns all throughout the Great Britain at the time.
So basically, it's like the only people who had kids were old men already, or older men.
Yeah.
And like brand new pubescent children.
Yes. So basically, that's why it's called the Lost Generation. There was no prom that year.
Years.
They were dead.
Yeah, no shit.
The young women of that age had lost all their young men. There was literally entire villages, like in Scotland and England and Wales, that weren't big and probably only had 120 young men who served, and they all died, every single one of them. They were just gone.
I would love to know stories about what the women were doing instead. Were they finally discovering each other? I'm trying to make this light. Okay?
No, I did actually look into it. So a lot of the women during this time of these small villages would just move to London. They would move to Bristol. They would move to Birmingham. They'd move to these big cities because there wasn't men there was no one to marry. And in 1916, that's your job as a woman. I'm sorry, but that's how society made it back then. They were
unfortunately can't just no experimentation as much back then.
Yeah, there probably was, but especially during that. I mean, let's be honest, they probably did. But like historically, they were supposed to go find a family, and all the candidates were now dead. Yeah. Of course, some of them stayed behind, and the younger people who weren't old enough to fight would grow up, and that could happen. Yeah. But for years, there was just no one, and it was just like, it's just like, imagine your entire high school class now being split, where all the men are gone.
Yeah,
like it's just
that would be me. That would be me and you.
We're just gone. There's no one there. That's why it's called the Lost Generation. They just died at the Somme. So it's this one battle just killed all those people, and Scotland suffered a lot too. Lost a lot of men who were young and trying to show off with their bagpipes and stuff. So,
don't do that.
But the Somme was a victory for the Allies. It was a Pyrrhic victory, but they did win. And then a year later or so, the Americans would show up and basically rip through Germany. So
we did that twice.
Yeah, the first one was a lot faster. First time we just came in.
First one.
One of my favorite notes of the American assault on the Arras Forest was the Kaiser sent a strongly worded letter to President Woodrow Wilson saying, "Shotguns are cheating. Stop." I'm paraphrasing. That's basically what he said.
Yeah.
The guy using gas and fire was saying it was a war crime to use shotguns in war.
So shotguns will end you much quicker than gas will.
Yeah, Americans just jump in trenches with shotguns, just drop a whole line, just stand there and fire forward.
Boom, boom, boom.
Yeah. But yeah, that's the end of the Somme. That's what I got for us this week.
Yay! I managed to make a lot of funny jokes in this one, surprisingly.
I'm glad someone's here to keep it light, because it's a very depressing
I've noticed that
time.
Episode 28 into Lore Lords, one of my greatest contributions to this show is turning shit like that and making jokes. Again, I think my favorite joke I made was the croissant one, maybe.
Yeah. I had that from breakfast, yeah. I actually looked up, so I have this kind of weird obsession with rations. And another thing I can bring up now is I did look up the rations during this time and the food they ate at the Somme. And most of it was cooked. There's even footage. There's video footage of them baking bread by like the 100. Like they just have these massive makeshift ovens and these massive you get like the flat spatula style scrapers get pizzas out kind of thing. They were like that, but they were like 10 feet long. I'm not exaggerating. And they were just pulling out.
Make a lot of food. You can just make food underground, honestly. Like using the ground and carving out. I've should do a Lore Lords on weird cooking styles, honestly. But yeah, there's ways you can carve out mud areas and make mud ovens and stuff. So
they would just.
I don't know if that's what they did.
No, they had actual kitchens, because remember the British were on the offensive, so they always had safe fallback areas. So they had kitchens set up. Sure. They had hospitals.
That's good.
And stuff like that. So they would send people back, but they were making loaves of bread by the dozens of dozens. They were just
they had fresh
and they were
bread.
cooking up. They were pumping up bread. Most of the meat was what's known as beef tea, which is just as bad as it sounds. It's dehydrated beef stuffed into a can, so you have to put it in hot water and drink it, basically.
It's still protein.
Yeah, pretty rough.
And what's that called? Oh my god, collagen too.
Collagen, yeah.
You can probably get some collagen.
There was a lot of bone in it, for sure.
It's good. It's good for your. That's really good for your joints and your cartilage.
So it kept the soldiers alive. They got food.
Yeah, that's nutrients, man. That's really it.
Yeah,
that's the backbone of any army is fucking getting food.
Where the Germans literally had to eat half a loaf of bread a day. That was all you got. So that was a big event bonus for the rest of the war for the Allies too. The dwindling supply shortage on the Germans that we talked about wasn't just guns and ammunition. It was food.
Right.
Huge food shortage at the front. Happened in World War II as well. Huge food shortage. Towards the end of the Second World War, the German army stopped having rations. So,
good.
Great times.
So,
anyway,
like I said at the beginning of the round, the beginning of this Lore Lords, when you're Germany, you're in the middle of everything. You can't just get shit. It's not gonna happen.
Yeah, well,
good.
That's the end of the episode, guys. Thanks for listening to me talk about World War One again. We'll be back.
Thank you very much for dishing it out, bro.
I'll be back in another war story soon. Probably Gallipoli will be my next one. So if you like Australians, look forward to that.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Have a great night, everybody, and thanks for listening.